dad wants you to come home. So they can fill my head with more Disney lies about how perfect the world is? I don't think so. Yeah, why don't you just go back to your Justin Timberlake and your homework, you conformist asshole. You just don't know what real pain is.
In the world of music, fad genres that seemed like the future, only to end up as time capsules of eras that they came from, are a dime a dozen. If the 2000s proved anything, then it's just that. A decade full of scenes and subgenres, out to take the world by storm, only to end up a relic of an era-long past. I mean, hell, it's not even something that only happened in the 2000s. We just saw this play out again with hyperpop's short-lived flash in the pan. Look, Zoomers, I'm sorry I have to tell you this, but Eliotto and 100 gecs are already on the fast track to becoming semi-embarrassing guilty pleasures in the same vein as Broken Side and The Millionaires.
Give me that UV, cheap alcohol please. Straight up and on the rocks, my liver's hella shot. Fuck all the bros and jocks, tonight I'm rolling with the cops.
But don't get it twisted. It's not just the weird and kind of memey music that tends to go down this rabbit hole. Even industrial spawned its own fad genres during its decline in popularity, one of them being the subject of this very video. Industrial as a genre was quickly falling victim to the same decline many other genres at that era were facing, seeing its cultural peak in the 90s with bands like Nine Inch Nails, Skinny Puppy, and KMFDM, and by the end of the decade it was already starting to falter in its popularity. While I might be a slut for the genre myself, your average normie probably isn't going to want to listen to a dude scream about his drug addiction over a malfunctioning air conditioner once the intrigue wears off. So at the turn of the century, a new take on the genre began to creep its way out of the club scene, and in comes Aggrotech. An edgy and eclectic take on the industrial sound with a heavy emphasis on hard techno, psytrance, violent and hedonistic lyrics, and a shrill pitch-shifted scream aesthetic. Like many other genres, it was one that held very strong prominence of its time, but is now a relic of the era of MySpace, cybergoths, and embarrassing dance videos forever ingrained in meme culture. But you know, to the greater public, they might not understand just what this whole thing is. So why don't we just get into it and talk about just what in the hell was Aggrotech? While Aggrotech didn't come to prominence until around the early 2000s, it was birthed out of the eclectic mix of trends in the goth club scene of the 90s, though its roots reach far deeper than that. In its early days, industrial music was an offshoot of the punk movement. The band most often cited as the genre's progenitors was a little band from London known as Throbbing Gristle. Now, Throbbing Gristle is one of the most important bands of the 70s, not only for their influence on industrial, but noise music and performance art in general. At the height of punk rock's takeover of the underground music scene, the mantra of the genre became learn 3 chords and start a band.
The music was done on the premise that everybody is capable of making music, whether they realize it or not, that we all have a genius factor, and that a musical instrument is just something that makes a noise. Therefore, anything that makes a noise is an instrument, but also anybody who can make it make a noise is a musician. They don't need to know the right way to do it, or the correct, skillful way to do it. In fact, that could even be a hindrance because they might never discover something really unique that they did by accident because they didn't know the right way. So they will tune it incorrectly, which means they'll get chords no one else will ever get. So our basic approach became that you can't make mistakes. You can only make things that either appeal or don't appeal to certain people. Some people like it, some don't, but that's true of everything.
To counter this, Throbbing Gristle was born out of bandleader Genesis P. Orridge's desire to push this idea to its logical limit by producing music without knowing how to play an instrument and using household items, power tools, industrial equipment, hence the name, and broken instruments to create a strange and off-putting noise. The band's music carries an eerie yet distinct DIY sound to it, and for the 70s, it was almost alien to everything else that had come before it, as if it was the free jazz of its period. This chaotic, odd, and fresh sound at the time would influence far more than just industrial music, and it would have a big hand in influencing noise, avant-garde rock, and performance art. This is far from the traditional Skinny Puppy or Nine Inch Nails sound that many modern industrial fans are accustomed to, but it's where it all started, and if you're ever wondering what old rivet heads are constantly yapping about, it's this band and this sound. Now, the industrial that we know of today was mainly influenced by a string of 80s bands that took the dark, noisy experimental sound that Throbbing Gristle laid the groundwork for and brought in influences of more traditional genres. Among these names would be the holy trinity of Ministry, Skinny Puppy, and KMFDM. Each band has their own storied history and fair share of amazing records. But what's important to the context of Aggrotech is the schism that they caused in the industrial sound. Skinny Puppy took a much more electronic and atmospheric approach to their music, where Ministry flirted with metal and hardcore, and as for KMFDM, they carved their own niche somewhere in the middle, bringing in both punk and rave elements to the mix. Each of these bands would play their own unique part in both expanding the sound of industrial as well as making it a bit more normalized, bringing in a lot of fresh blood to the scene as well as a lot of new fans into the fold. People that might not have connected with Throbbing Gristle or Coil or those bands were more than likely going to be able to find something within Ministry if they were a metalhead, or in the case of KMFDM, enjoy their more DIY punk aesthetic, and as for Skinny Puppy, I think I described it pretty well in my unnerving music video, but they more or less created the soundtrack to horror films, but in a contemporary industrial format. And by the time Nine Inch Nails had rolled around, this schism between rock and electronic-focused industrial music only grew. Now, to add into the mix the other musical genres beginning to make their way into the goth scene, such as the rise of dark electro music played at raves and alternative clubs, and the crossover found in the black metal community. And no, I'm not about to sit here and tell you that black metal was a goth genre. Calm down, you fucking nerds. But there was a bit of a crossover from both the metal and goth community that found themselves entranced by bands like Bathory and Burzum. And it was this mixture of elements that would really go on to help inspire Aggrotech. I forgot something. Right. Something I have yet to really mention, primarily due to it being a pretty large rabbit hole of its own, is EBM, otherwise known as electronic body music. EBM was a genre that, outside of a handful of artists, was essentially a Eurotrash exclusive, though when the Amerifats and Canucks gave a shot, it would produce some good stuff as well. The gist of the sound is that it's a mixture of industrial, synth pop, disco, and punk music, mostly enjoyed in the darker corners of the club scene at the time. The term was coined originally by Rolf Huttler of the influential German band Kraftwerk. Some of the most popular bands to come out of the genre would be Die Krupps, Front 242, and the criminally underrated Nitzer Ebb.
We're so strong, we're so pure. We know we are, we know we are. Won't you come and join us in our playground? It's a fire playground.
And while the genre can be pretty cheesy at times, it's more than worth your time, and plenty of great records spawn from it, one of them actually being Ministry's second album, Twitch. While EBM might be a lesser known genre, it's one whose influence cannot be understated. It was one of the big moments in alternative music that helped bridge the gap of the noise and ambient-laden early days of industrial into the more contemporary fusion we know it as today, and a sound that many future influential artists would get their inspiration from. Aggrotech got its beginnings in the early 90s with bands like Hocico and Suicide Commando, though at the time the rave elements weren't as prominent, and the genre first gained notoriety under the name Terror EBM, to differentiate these artists' harsher and angrier tone from the more dance-oriented sound of EBM's previous incarnations. As you can hear, this is less the sound that you would think of when you hear the term Aggrotech, and more so something in line with Skinny Puppy's 80s output. But the heavier emphasis on rave and raw aggression was still there, and as the 90s went on and we saw punk-oriented rave acts like The Prodigy,
I'm the travel starter, fucking instigator. I'm the fear addicted, danger illustrated.
and digital hardcore pioneers such as Atari Teenage Riot, rise to much higher than what most would probably suspect, it did help embolden many artists of the time to start taking influence from rave music and start to fuse it with terror EBM and electro-industrial. And I could be wrong on this, but I do think it's interesting that around the same time would be when many of these bands would put down their 80s sequencers and Moog synthesizers in favor of pounding 909 drum machines and the at the time popular virtual analog synths. And this could really be heard in the wave of bands that would begin to form during the late 90s and early 2000s, many of them seeing a decent level of success among the alternative clubbing scene. I think the best example here would be the genre's poster children, Cyclone 9. Now talk about a massive step forward. Cyclone 9 took the building blocks of Hosiko and Suicide Commando and brought in an even heavier amount of aggression. Something I mentioned earlier was black metal, and this is where its more obvious elements would be brought into the mix. Now, these vocals that you heard are not your typical metal screams at the time. Rather, they're far more reminiscent to the shrieks found in black metal. Now just add some pitch shifting into the mix. And do you see what I mean? Hell, some of the bands from this era would eventually evolve into black metal inspired groups themselves, such the likes of Dawn of Ashes, who started off sounding like this, and eventually just turning into this. And this wasn't solely unique to them either. Even Cyclone 9 would go down this road as well. And while I'm not saying that this is the most traditional black metal thing that exists, or even that it's black metal at all, it's obviously heavily inspired by that sound, and something that had served as a bit of a building block along with the more obvious EBM and industrial influence of the core Aggrotech sound. But you know what? Maybe I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. I think it's time we talk about the Golden Age. To be completely honest for a second, Aggrotech never quite hit the mainstream. It was almost always underground, with maybe a few artists here or there getting some mainstream attention for about 5 fucking minutes, but that's about it. It always was a very small pond. But for being as niche of a subgenre as it was, it did see some pretty big heights, with many of the prominent bands within the subgenre playing festivals like Mariluna, and some doing some decent sized tours in Eastern Europe and even across the coasts of the United States. But there was a time in the mid-2000s where it did seem like it could be the future and actually make it mainstream. During the mid-2000s, there was a very small yet very influential resurgence of goth culture, with acts like the Birthday Massacre gaining some serious notoriety, Skinny Puppy and Ministry both returning from breaks or even outright breakups, and Mindless Self-Indulgence being at the height of their popularity, blurring the lines between punks, industrial fans, goths, and scene kids. So it was essentially the perfect storm to create the opportunity for Aggrotech to start reaching out to a more mainstream audience, with websites like MySpace and Vampire Freaks being great hubs for bands to attract new fans. And it was during that era where we saw projects like Comi Christ, Aesthetic Perfection, and Alien Vampires come to prominence, becoming just as big and sometimes even bigger than the bands who had preceded them. Alien Vampires is definitely the least known out of the mentioned artists, but they became a popular name at the time, mostly due to their stylish aesthetic and outlandish song titles. I mean, come on, this is a band that has a song called Foot Job Addiction. Alien Vampires was one of those artists that really helped solidify the look and aesthetics of Aggrotech. What most of us would conflate with the term cybergoth is more or less what the Aggrotech aesthetic looked like. Latex, Catholic and satanic imagery, guns, gas masks, and, of course, the famous neon dreadlocks. All key elements that you would see across most bands in the genre, as well as that one fucking ping pong video. While this all might seem like style over substance, and it absolutely was, it was also some of the best marketing that any scene could ask for. Who wouldn't be curious as to what a subculture full of people that dressed like this revolved around? Now, to talk about the two bands who eventually became the most successful out of the genre, we do have to address a massive elephant in the room. Aesthetic Perfection and Comi Christ might have formed inside of the Aggrotech bubble, but it was actually their distinct characteristics that separated them from the pack that would lead them to the success that they would see. Comi Christ in particular is a band that has always existed in the fringes of Aggrotech, and I don't say this as any sort of dig either. They would actually be the people who I would consider to be the best band to come from this niche, and their success is simply due to the fact that Andy LaPlaga set himself apart from day one. Coming from the legendary future pop group Icon of Coil, Andy already had a very different approach to the sound than what most of his contemporaries would, and when it came time to form Comi Christ, he would originally take a much more instrumental and terror EBM approach to the whole thing.
In my life,
and while tracks like This Is My Rifle would help him see some early success, the Comi Christ that we all know and love wouldn't really come to be until their second record, when LaPlaga would begin to include vocals as a prominent feature in his music, with their album, What the Fuck Is Wrong With You People? This album took the harsh electronic sound and overall template of Aggrotech and absolutely flipped it on its head with some of the cleanest production the genre had seen yet, and a massive influence from punk and nu metal music really expanded what you could expect from the genre. And this direction would only be pushed even further with 2009's Today We Are All Demons. The lighter tone and more punk-style screams set Comi Christ apart from the pack, and with the higher-end production and less off-putting aesthetic that the band had compared to their contemporaries, it would really break them out to the more metal-focused side of the community, something that not many other Aggrotech bands had really been able to do without absolutely transforming themselves into something different. Comi Christ was even able to gain the attention of German powerhouse Rammstein and earn a slot on an arena tour opening for them. And if you thought a little Aggrotech band couldn't get any bigger than that, well, Capcom would eventually approach them to produce a soundtrack for Devil May Cry. Yeah, the DMC remake might not be the most favorable among fans, but it was still a fun game, and its soundtrack, at least in my opinion, more than makes up for many of its shortcomings. Though it was DMC that brought an end to the band's time as an Aggrotech project. With DMC, Comi Christ was using some of their older songs, as well as producing some straight-up metal tracks. And it was after this that the band would transition into more of a full-fledged metal project.
You fucking hate it, there is nothing left inside. Empty threats pouring out of the wounds. Used to be a fucking star. Look at you now.
Industrial elements still make appearances here and there, but regardless, they had essentially become an entirely new project. And while some might see this as Andy selling out, but in all reality, it's actually helped keep the Aggrotech genre alive because many fans and listeners who would never have given Aggrotech a chance now get into the genre because they go through the band's back catalog. Now, the other crown jewel of Aggrotech's golden age would be aesthetic perfection. Yeah, I know some of you fucking nerds want my head for saying that. Daniel Graves might be a divisive figure today for his change in sound and his pretty obnoxious personality.
I enjoy Nicki Minaj.
Charge!
But in his early days, he was definitely a force to be reckoned with. The first 3 Aesthetic Perfection records could easily be looked at as a trilogy of evolution in terms of the Aggrotech sound. 2005's Close to Human is your standard Aggrotech affair. While it not be as heavy as Cyclone 9 per se, it very much sounds like a love letter to Hosiko. Albeit a bit more modernized. Close to Human was far from a massive release, but it helped to get Daniel's name out there a bit. And once 2008 rolled around and the second Aesthetic Perfection record, A Violent Emotion, dropped, it would absolutely change the game. Whereas Comi Christ brought more punk and nu metal influence to the sound, Aesthetic Perfection brought swing and pop.
I don't feel no remorse, and I don't feel sympathy. Well, I don't feel anything.
This is probably the most mass marketable and accessible sound to come from the Aggrotech scene, but it was this that really set this project apart. And over the years, Daniel has continued to venture further outside of the Aggrotech bubble and even the greater industrial bubble, continually dipping his toes into pop music, dark wave, and actually even some metal music here and there. And while there are plenty of other artists to talk about, I do think that Comi Christ, Aesthetic Perfection, and Alien Vampires are kind of the big ones to really understand what this sound was all about, especially during its heyday. As by this point, both Cyclone 9 and Dawn of Ashes had really started to delve more into their metal sound, and Suicide Commando and Hosiko had really kind of become legacy artists at this point, still putting out great stuff and occasionally pushing the boundary, but not yet having their revival, which would come more in the early 2010s. Now, I hate to use the term insert genre is dead, because even in the nichest of scenes, there's still artists kicking around, and most genres actually end up seeing resurgences, even if it's by a different means or even under a different name. But to say a genre's relevance has died is just a cold hard fact, and during the early 2010s, Aggrotech would really begin to fizzle out, with many of the big names from the genre either ending up broken up or switching to more conventional sounds, like just about everyone I've mentioned here. While new bands like Ludovico Technique and Misfit Toys would pop up and develop cult followings, the heyday was more or less over. Industrial was pretty dormant as a genre outside of a few bands and wouldn't see a real resurgence until the latter part of the decade. Now, I don't really have any definitive proof as to why Aggrotech faded out when it did, but I think the overall decline in popularity of the goth culture and just outright genre fatigue is more likely what did it in. As creative as Aggrotech can be at times, it's a bit of a one-trick pony, at least outside of its standout artists. And much like any other fad genre, it might have sounded like the future in its early days, but after a while the whole thing starts to look like a time capsule. It's very reminiscent to that of new wave music, where people thought the big poofy hair, the colorful outfits, the new romantic clothing, and the cheesy 80s synthesizer FM sound would be what stayed the future, where now it really is a fad. It's something that stays of the past, and when you see or hear new wave music, it just reeks of the early to mid 80s. And that's not me trying to say there's anything wrong with that, it's just kind of how things go. And with Aggrotech, it's not completely dead. There are still some bands that pop up, but its relevance has come and gone, and while I would like to see a revival or a resurgence take place that maybe would even take the world by storm, I'm also not really going to hold my breath. As goofy and off-putting as the genre can be, its aesthetics have continued to be a staple of goth clubs and even meme culture of all things. Many of the genre's most beloved bands are still actually active to this day, with the likes of Cyclone 9, Hosiko, and Comi Christ. So, maybe we will see what the future holds. Maybe it will be like nu metal or crunkcore and find its way back into the limelight. But I guess we're just gonna have to wait and see what the future holds. Now, before I end the video, these are my pay piggies. The people who enjoy my slop content enough to show their support with their credit cards. They help me keep the lights on, and they guilt me into continuing to make content. So if you would like to support and see your name on this wall of shame here, do me a favor and shoot me a dono or a sub on Patreon or Ko-fi. All jokes aside, your support means the absolute world to me, and I'm extremely grateful that you even bother to watch my content in the first place. I hope to keep entertaining you, so as always, more content is on the way. But with all that being said, subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.